Well, this lecture is about the different proofs that schizophrenia is 8 disorders. And it's important to delineate what it means to say that it's 8 disorders and also understand why it's essentially 2 things done improperly when 3 things are done properly instead of some other variation of that. I explained in my other lecture that it's essentially responding in 2s, which is incorrect, and receiving things in 3s. And one way of proving, if you know that much, you can prove it's 8 disorders by just multiplying 2 times 2 times 2. The actual modeling, a little bit more complex. You kind of wonder why you have to take the exponent, 2 to the third, instead of adding it or multiplying it or subtracting it. It's fairly elaborate. You have to imagine the response is 3-dimensional, meaning that if they get 2 out of 3 correct in one direction, 2 out of 3 correct in the other direction, 2 out of 3 correct in the third direction, the combinatorial space or probability space is 2 times 2 times 2. So that's one way to prove it. The other is using Rorschach-Nies blot tests. I think Bloiler, it was Eugene Bloiler, at first defined dementia praecox as renamed as schizophrenia. He called it split brain personality. He didn't really think it was multiple personalities at the time. He believed it was dichotomous, or like done in 2s, and which is essentially correct. I mean, that's very similar to my theory. It's not. He thought a lot of other things, like it was perceptual, and it was just 2 diseases, and he didn't actually go so far to say it was 2 diseases, actually genetic diseases. But he went so far to say it meant you think in 2s, and which is essentially correct. But it's not how you get the number of disorders it is until you understand what disorders it represents. At least make strides towards it. When you see this 2 things, Menninger also had insight that he wrote that book, Man Against Himself. He defined the arabesque concept, which has been known to the Arabs for some time, as self-opposed. It basically means that a person is both good and bad, or forward and backwards, or upwards and downwards, or just sort of like positive and negative, like happy and sad. You would think that would more apply to bipolar type 2 or by type 1 even. But he applied it to schizophrenia. He defined it as someone that gets healthier when they get worse, and in one way and another way, and at the same time in both ways, or something. Basically, it means that a person gets a little bit better, gets a little bit worse in different ways, and so he goes forward and backwards. He ends up getting nowhere because the 2 cancel. They're in the opposite directions. 1 minus 1 is 0. That's why most schizophrenics are essentially 0. Menninger realized that. It's Carl Menninger. I highly recommend reading his book, Man Against Himself. If you're not familiar with that kind of concept thinking, it's instructive for my lectures and what I do. I've never actually fully read the book. I've read parts of it. I've never read anything original by Bloiler. I don't know if he exists. I believe it's would be 100 years old by now. But he thought it was 2 things too. So a lot of psychiatrists in advanced nosology were on the right track. But the thing about Rorschach-Nies blot test is called clickoscopy, I believe, or clickoscopy. It's clickodermy or whatever. It's the ink printing of symmetric objects. Rorschach had insight into it. He described this symmetry as inducing a state of euphoria or fantasy, or bringing forth their subconscious. He essentially thought it was 2 disorders, 2 or at least, not genetic, but essentially a split brain method for measuring people. What he didn't realize was that the symmetry of the Rorschach-Nies blot test is 8-fold, not 2-fold. And that's where you can go wrong with proofs of that sort of thing, because people look at it as a symmetric object. They assume the symmetry is 2-dimensional. What they don't realize is that in a lot of ways, since the smoke is 3-dimensional, or the ink blots are 3-dimensional and gaseous, that it's actually 8 dimensions. And the reason about that is a little bit tedious. You have to have a lot of physics, a lot of math, and a lot of computer science, and a lot of biology to realize that it's actually, you take 2 times 2 times 2. A lot of people who in the beginning study of gases will be told that gases are 9-dimensional, like tensile, or 3-dimensional, PV equals nRT, the ideal gas law, or like I believe in the Maxwell relationships in physical chemistry, there are only 3 independent variables, 3 dependent variables, like state variables. I think there are 6 Maxwell equations, like partial differential equations relating, it doesn't matter what it relates, like the Gibbs free energy, the pressure, the volume, the entropy, the temperature, the enthalpy, and the Helmholtz free energy, and the chemical potential, nu. Anyways, it takes a lot of insight. I really recommend studying a good 20 physics books all the way up to the doctoral level. Same with math, biology, computer science, and maybe chemistry. You really should, and maybe math modeling, like, you really should get better at that kind of thing. And I'm not saying you're going to read 100 books, but to leaf over them, get an idea of what they're talking about. If you're rich, like a psychologist or psychiatrist studying this, you can probably afford to do that. But you're not going to get anywhere reasoning the way I do about that kind of thing. You know, it could arguably take me over an hour to explain why you have to multiply 2 times 2 times 2 in order to get the correct model predictor. Like I said, a beginning physics student would assume that since it's smoke, it's 3-dimensional, 9-dimensional, maybe 4-dimensional, even 5-dimensional, since it's electromagnetic, neurons in the brain or something, or at least a replica of that, or neurally based, since there are 5 Maxwell equations. Actually, there are 4 Maxwell equations, but there's a continuity equation, it's essentially 5 things. So a lot of physicists would get the wrong idea. Others who saw that you have to take 2 and 2 and 2 would assume it's 6. So you could theoretically get 3, 4, 5, 6, 9. You can even get 7 too if you take left, right, up, down, front, bottom, and center. That's 7 things. So a lot of times you'll get the wrong conclusion. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how you get to a correct model. It just takes a lot of subtle assumptions while you use the product space. I really can't afford to get into a complex discussion of modeling physics. It's just something you have to be a genius at, and it won't do to not be a genius in it, because it's critical to my analysis. And I'm not saying that you wouldn't understand that it's 8 dimensions. It's been proven by Cloninger. It's just that until you do the physics, you're not really going to be able to approach the modeling very well and reach correct conclusions and how to model without a lot of physics and math. You get exposed to that kind of thing, how to model better, and I'd say 5,000, 6,000 physics, maybe civil engineering, mechanical engineering, stuff like that. The other proofs I have is I used to view schizophrenia as an attachment disorder. You view it as 2 things, forward and back. You can view it as 8 things, forward, back, up, down, left, right. This is a 3-dimensional space. It's one of the easier proofs I have. It's basically a particle in the middle that can go up, down, top, bottom, or right, left. It's a simple product space of the 3 dimensions. Basically, the dichotomous switch in each of the 3 dimensions, the product space is just 8. The way you model that in physics, you have to take the probability space, because that's the number of symmetries that exist, meaning that if it's defined as an attachment disorder, there's a tendency towards an attachment disorder. That means there's 8 ways to attach yourself. You define the organism as healthy and equilibrium. Equilibrium is an attachment disorder for the mentally ill person. Therefore, if they are torn between forward and back, like man against himself and manager, left and right, top and bottom, the complexity of that is not 4, 8, or not 4, 9, or 6, or a higher number. It's just 8. You have to multiply them together. It's the richness, like 3 indices, multiplied together, 2 for each index. X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Not 6. A lot of beginning physics students assume it's 6. You multiply 3 times 2. It's not really the way physics works. The other way I proved it was I did certain things like I viewed it as genetics, and there are 3 codons. Meaning if something goes wrong in one codon, it'll chain to the others as a residual effect, meaning the first codon is the only one in error, maybe the third or the second, but if one's in error, the other 2 code incorrectly because the thing is wrong as a whole, meaning that each codon models, the 3 codons models for 3 individual events at a richness of 2 apiece, meaning that if the first one is wrong, the second is wrong, and the third is wrong because the whole word is wrong. I mean, the richness of it is 8. It gives you insight into genetics. I would strongly recommend psychiatrists and psychologists start looking at every disease as being 8 disorders. It's probably the truth, but I couldn't really say. Some of them, like Down syndrome, appear to be probably more than that. I even think bipolar is 8 disorders. I used to think it was 9 because I viewed it as 10 style. Now I view it as 8. So it's 8 disorders too. I used to think schizoaffective was 17, a combination of 9 and 8. Schizophrenia and bipolar. Now I believe it's 8 too. It's a little bit complex why they're not as symptomatic. The other proofs I have of it they're not really elaborate. They're strange. You view it as schizophrenia as a curve that is 2-dimensionally responded. meaning that if the weakness being a proper three-dimensional response is three-dimensional, the weakness in a two-dimensional curve is eight-dimensional, or not really dimensional, but like has 8 error signs. You can view it that way. It's really very simple. That and the other proof I gave are really the two easiest ones, the attachment disorder. I had 4 other proofs of it, 4 or 5 other proofs. I forgot what they were offhand. Some of them are very ingenious. I based it on like the Eightfold Way of Muriel Mann, won the Nobel Prize several years, about 4 decades ago. That's a little bit elaborate, thinking about it that complexly. Please be quiet, Christina. You think about it that elaborately. I don't really wish to go into that. I mean, quantum chromodynamics is a 7,000 course in most universities that offer advanced physics. I'll go into that some other time, but yes, quantum chromodynamics and quantum gravity and general relativity play a role in psychiatry. Why? Because the significance of influence of quantum effects or subatomic effects oscillates, eventually attenuates for massive aggregates of particles, meaning that it's good at one point, cancels at one point, eventually it merges and attenuates. So the large clusters of particles do indeed form aggregate quantities that obey quantum mechanics. Just like there are electrons going around a proton, there are also planets going around the sun. That's an effective quantum gravity, quantum mechanics, quantum chromodynamics, and so forth. So it's really not that hard to see. Lots of advanced physics. Even if you know the physics, you'll find it a surprising result that even things like affect are indeed governed by the non-locality of the Feynman diagram. It's the only reason why affect appears so rich is because it's basically a dictionary. You can, by coupling your reaction or interaction with another person, you can read an entire plethora of responses from the other person, meaning that you can respond happy, they respond happy. You respond sad, they respond sad. Even if they're not looking or paying attention or directly interacting with you, you can still interact that way. And it will seem like a meaningful response. It'll be a lot fainter since you're not being explicitly talking to them, but you can generally observe results in that sort of thing. So it's a real science. And really the only way to explain something like non-locality, or the richness of human interaction, is basically to assume that it's two-dimensional. It emits an entire plane of solutions, a complete description, fluidity description, continuity is preserved, and you have an entire spectrum, or eigenspectrum of responses, one for each particular thing. That's what they don't understand. Most neurochemists don't understand neurochemistry. It's three-dimensional, third-order logic, really, but it's based on the laws of the universe in category. The laws of physics in category theory are essentially similar. That's kind of deep if you think about concepts being arranged in the same way the rules of physics are arranged for cosmology. It's a deep principle. You can also say that with this in mind, you can say that the human brain is basically just a replication of the laws of the physics of the universe. It's also a replication of category theory. Once you realize that the universe is inherently categorical according to biology and other fields like psychology, as well as being physical and mathematical. In fact, 6 or 7 things. 7 being theology, the transcendental number that pushes physics beyond reality, is contained in 6 and limited by 7, meaning it's only 6 things. All the 7s are zeros, for instance. It relates to the way space is infinite, yet the universe is finite. I don't want to get too much into that. I'll conclude this lecture by saying that the curve method is one of the easier ways to model it, like a curve moving through space. You can use the T and B frame, derive some more richness, like talk about a response being jagged lined or straight lined or curved or torsional or bitorsional or normal or tangent, or can model a lot of things that way, like what the kind of response, what it typically predicts. And using advanced analysis, like Calculus 3 based analysis, you can even look at it in a way that you could say that a schizophrenic response is indeed two-dimensional, but when the torsion, the normal, or the binormal are 0, 1, or -1, you get like different responses. I haven't really gone into that far. I don't really think there's richness in it. You can obviously derive some psychotherapy or psychodynamics from it, but I haven't really gone categorically that way. You could probably probably come to the conclusion that trauma is one thing, health is another thing, and staleness is a third thing. So that's a useful model. I recommend someone do some modeling on that and figure out which way it works. But that's all it is. Schizophrenia is a two-dimensional response to a three-dimensional stimulus, and there is no distortion in the perception. It's all in the response. You wonder what this means for neurochemistry, to say that an organism doesn't have any problem with its sensations but has a problem with response. What I would tend to suggest that means is that their body works fine, but their brain neurochemistry is messed up, or at least the way it relates back to the body. There might be something subtle like a response switch or something, like a central hub that all the responses go through in the brain. It might even be a neurochemical pathway, meaning that the axons and dendrites are structured in a way that inhibits a proper response. You could say that in healthy people, there's three neurochemicals reacting at any point. In a mentally ill person, there's only two. That might provide a model. I think it's something more complex, like the fluidic electro-quantum gravity randomness is six-dimensional, meaning that the electrochemical richness of the neuron response is fluidic. It's six-dimensional. It's not nine-dimensional. You think about it, that's another way of getting at two, because six is essentially two, because there's three dimensions each for XYZ. You just divide by 3, you get the number 2. That may seem a bit complex. Again, that's why I'm a modeling genius and why I see so many results, is because I can see things like that. A lot of people would say a six-dimensional curve like fluidic response is incompatible with a two-dimensional disease or an eight-dimensional disease. But it is indeed confluent and consistent and leads to great results. And I'll get into other lectures later on describing why the results are so consistent, like explaining all the facets of clinical, or at least evaluational diagnosology in schizophrenia, what the basic responses are, how my theory predicts them, why my theory is complete, and why my theory is in fact the only one that elaborately and completely explains everything, makes new predictions, is logically consistent, logically whole, logically comprehensive, covers every type of schizophrenia, is integrated with a normal biology to explain what a normal person is differentiates, integrates, compares, contrasts, and even predicts new things, predicts old things, and even provides the bridgeway between health and sickness, and vice versa. And eventually the model, I've already derived this, but the model even explains for cognitive properties why mentally ill people use word salad and are delusional and grandiose and narcissistic and hedonistic and things like that. Explain those things too, but I'll get to that in another lecture.